Hey there, guess what?
What?
It's chapter 32, Deuterostomes! Okay, so by the end of this chapter, you should be able to define what a deuterostome is and explain why they're ecologically and evolutionarily important. You should be able to describe the echinoderm body plan and compare the major echinoderm lineages. You should be able to describe the chordate body plan and compare the major chordate lineages. You should be able to list and describe the relationships amongst the major lineages of vertebrates. You should be able to explain the importance of different kinds of vertebrate adaptations like jaws, limbs, amniotic eggs, placentas, parental care, flight, and ear bones. You should be able to summarize the known history of the hominid lineages from the common ancestors shared with chimps to modern humans. Okay, so you remember in the last chapter we talked about the protostomes, right? And the protostomes are a sister group to the deuterostomes. The deuterostomes have 4 phyla in them. The first phyla are the echinoderms. So you know what those are. Those are like sea stars, which you might know as starfish, and sea urchins. There's a group you probably don't know called the hemichords. And so these are acorn worms. They kind of look like that. They burrow in the soil in marine environments, and they are either deposit feeders or suspension feeders. There's another group you haven't heard of called Xenoturbella, and so those are these weird worm-like species, if you're interested. And then the chordates, and you know what those are, because that's what we are. So that group includes the vertebrates, and so we're going to talk about different kinds of vertebrates like hagfish, lampreys, sharks and rays, bony fish, amphibians, mammals, and reptiles. And one kind of a reptile that you see all the time is a bird.
Hey, wait a minute.
What?
I'm not a reptile.
Well, I mean, you're technically a reptile.
Okay, fine.
Alright, name the 4 deuterostome phyla.
Chordates.
Alright?
Oh, you got the easy one.
Yeah?
Got the easy one.
Alright, okay, come on, name the other ones. Echinoderms. Yeah? What else?
Xenoturbella.
Almost? And what's the other one?
That's the hemichord one.
Yeah, let's take a look. Alright, so you know the echinoderms and the chordates, the other 2 are the hemichords and the Xenoturbella. Okay, so let's start with the echinoderms. The name echinoderm means spiny skin. All of the echinoderms are marine animals, so they're in salt water. There are 7,000 species that have been, named and described. The echinoderms are a monophyletic group, and they share 3 main synapomorphies. The first is that adults are radially symmetrical, meaning that you can kind of cut them into slices like a cake, and each of the slices are the same. They have an endoskeleton made of calcium carbonate. So what does it mean that they have an endoskeleton?
It means their skeleton is on the inside.
Yeah, their skeleton's on the inside. But unlike our skeleton that's made out of bone, their skeleton is made out of these tiny little calcium carbonate plates. And then the third synapomorphy is that they have a water vascular system with tube feet. So you can see here there's kind of a ring of plumbing that runs out to each of the arms of the sea star, and then running off of each of the arms are a series of bulbs, and they can squeeze this bulb, and that forces water out to kind of extend out each of these tube feet, so they can manipulate whether they stick out a tube foot or retract it using these ampulla here. I should also point out, even though the adults are radially symmetric, the larvae are bilaterally symmetric. Okay. The kind of symmetry that the adults have is called pentaradial symmetry. So what's penta mean?
It means 5.
Yeah, 5. So basically you can cut a sea star or a sea urchin into 5 even pieces. And so we think that pentaradial symmetry evolved early in echinoderm evolution because all the echinoderms have pentaradial symmetry as a synapomorphy. Oh, I should also point out that the radial symmetry that you see in echinoderms is something that evolved that is a synapomorphy of the group, right? The ancestor of the echinoderm is bilaterally symmetrical. Okay, so echinoderms have all sorts of different ecologies. Some of them are mass feeders like us, where they bite off chunks of food like the sea urchin, just biting off chunks of seaweed. Suspension feeders, so some of them will kind of sit there in the water and kind of scoop up food as it falls past, or deposit feeders that work their way along the bottom of the ocean picking up food. There's also predators, so sea stars are predators, and they look all chill like this, but really what they're doing is they use their tube feet. They'll kind of go over the top of a bivalve like a clam or a mussel, and they'll use their tube feet to slightly prise open the bivalve shell, and then rather than trying to get the bivalve out of its shell, instead the starfish will extrude its stomach into the shell and then use the shell as a container to digest all of the food, and then when all the food has been digested in the sea star or the starfish's stomach, it will pull the stomach back into its own body. So Pisaster acracius is called a keystone species. So in some of the early ecological studies, researchers found that if you removed Pisaster from an environment, the entire ecosystem crashed. So it's a species that has a disproportionately large effect on other species. Sea urchins are also really important grazers, and important often in a negative way. So their grazing can destroy kelp forests. So in periods of time when otters, who really like to eat sea urchins, are gone, sea urchins will take over and just eat all the kelp. And then when otters come back, then the sea urchins are less, and then there's more kelp. Sea urchins have this cool structure called an Aristotle's lantern, which is a kind of a little calcium carbonate. I don't know, it looks like a little lantern, and at the bottom it has these little 5 teeth, and it can use those to chew and kind of bite off pieces of algae. Alright, so these are the lineages of echinoderms. You have the crinoids, which are like the feather stars and sea lilies. And so you see there's lots and lots of fossils of these. We still have some around, although they're a little bit less common than other echinoderms nowadays. Sea stars, so they can have up between 5 and 40 arms. You have brittle stars or basket stars that look a little bit like this, and so they have a central disc and skinny arms, and so they can actually kind of walk around on the bottom of the ocean. They're quite fast, as opposed to sea stars that are slow. Some of these are predators. Basket stars will use their arms. Their arms will branch and branch and branch, and they'll basically act like a spider in a web and block areas and then catch animals that swim past. Sea urchins and sand dollars are in the echinoidea. And so, you know what, this is a sea urchin. A sand dollar is flat with very short, soft spines. You tend to find sand dollars on fine sand ocean bottoms. And then finally, sea cucumbers. They kind of look like soft, squishy cucumbers with a mouth at one end and an anus at the other. Okay. So on from the echinoderms to the chordates. So all chordates have 4 morphological features at some stage in their life cycle. So all chordates have throat openings called pharyngeal gill slits.
Wait a minute, I don't have that.
Well, you don't have that now, but we'll talk about how you used to have that.
I don't remember having gill slits.
Okay, dog. Well, I'll show you in a minute, okay?
Okay.
The second morphological feature that they have is a hollow dorsal nerve cord. So they have a nerve cord that runs the length of the body, comprised of little projections from neurons. They have a stiff and supportive rod called the notochord. So it's stiff, but it can be flexed against. So, and that will run the length of the body.
Wait a minute, I don't have one of them.
Well, you don't have one of them now.
Yeah, I don't have one of them now.
Okay, but let me show you in a minute how you used to have one.
Okay, fine.
A muscular post-anal tail.
I got one of them, but you don't have one of them.
Okay, fine. I don't have a muscular post-anal tail, but I did at some point in my life cycle. Okay, so the phylum Chordata is made up of 3 major lineages or subphyla. The Cephalochordates, the urochordates, and the vertebrates. So the vertebrates have a backbone, like a proper backbone, right? And so we would say the vertebrates have, sort of a backbone. And then the invertebrate chordates are the cephalochordates and the urochordates. Okay. All right. So name the 4 chordates synapomorphies.
They got a tail.
Yeah, you got a tail. What else?
Pharyngeal gill slits, which I definitely don't have.
Okay. What else?
Hollow dorsal nerve cord.
Yeah. What else?
That notochord that I definitely don't have.
Okay. Those are them. Okay, so the major groups of the invertebrate chordates are the lancelets. So they look kind of fishy, but they don't really have jaws. They're just kind of filter feeders that live in the bottom of the sand. Sea squirts, or tunicates. And so I'll show you in a little bit how we know, because if you look at these, they don't look like they have many of those structures either that would define them as a chordate, but I'll show you in a minute. The Cephalochordates and others, those are salps, squishy things that live in the ocean. And then the larvaceans, which are kind of weird tadpole-like things, like this. So those are the four groups of invertebrate chordates. So the cephalochordates are also known as lancelets, or they're also known as amphioxus. So they're very small, and they're mobile, and they're fish-like, and they are suspension feeders. So what does that mean if they're suspension feeders?
That means they catch the food that's raining down on them.
Yeah. So the adults will burrow in the sand, and then they'll kind of have their heads sticking out, and then catch food in their mouths. And so, if you look at them here, they have pharyngeal gill slits up the sides like this. Okay, so they suck water in and then kind of push the extra water through the gill slits and out of the body, and then trap all the food that's inside the gill slits. They have a dorsal hollow nerve cord where their nerves run through. They have a notochord. So when they swim, they have like this weird kind of flicking motion they can use as they flex against that notochord. And they have a muscular postanal tail.
How can you have a tail if it wasn't a postanal tail?
Yeah, I know. Isn't that a good question? I don't know. I guess it's just a way of defining where your tail is. Your tail is after your anus.
Well, obviously.
Yeah, but on some animals it's a little bit harder to tell.
Yeah, I guess.
Alright, so the urochordates are also known as tunicates. And if you look at an adult tunicate, you might not see all of the structures we associate with the chordate. So they definitely have a pharyngeal gill slit. They have, it's called a tunicate, like a tunic that the Greeks or Romans would wear. And so it's like an outer coating, like an outer layer of tissue over an inner layer of tissue. So they pull water through the middle, and then this is full of little holes, and then they'll just squeeze all of the extra water out of the holes and back out of the body, and then it'll keep all the food left over on the inside. Okay, so they definitely have pharyngeal gill slits when they are adults, but you can see when they're larvae, they have the pharyngeal gill slits here. They also, as larvae, have the hollow dorsal nerve cord and the notochord and the postanal tail. Okay? All right. All right, so the vertebrates include, hagfish, lampreys, sharks, rays, bony fish, amphibians, mammals, and reptiles and birds. And so we can see that even though some of us do not have a postanal tail as an adult,
That's so sad for you.
I don't feel like I need a tail.
I feel like you need a tail.
Okay, well, we can agree to disagree about that.
I mean, look at this tail.
Okay, fine. So there's in the embryo form, there's the muscular postanal tail. As an embryo, we have a notochord, okay? And if you look at a cross-section of an embryo, you can see it right here under the hollow dorsal nerve cord. And the notochord actually does some interesting things in terms of cell signaling to be able to kind of allow the brain and to correctly form. So we'll talk more about that later in the course. And we do actually have these pharyngeal gill slits or pouches on the neck when we are embryos. Okay. So in vertebrates, the dorsal hollow nerve cord becomes elaborated to become the spinal cord. So the embryonic pharyngeal pouches, if you are a fish, you can develop those into gills. But if you are a terrestrial species, you do not. All vertebrate embryos have a notochord, okay, but we don't really use it for support and movement. Instead, the vertebral column does that. And like I said before, early in development, the notochord helps organize the body plan, so it will secrete proteins that induce these blocks of cells called somites to develop. And so the somites are the cells that direct what will become the vertebrae, the ribs, and the skeletal muscles. So if you don't have a notochord, the rest of the embryo won't form correctly. All right, a salp is a tunicate that lives in the open water and drifts in the currents. It has no head and suspension feeds. Which of the characteristics allow the non-feeding larva to swim? Let's see. A, it has an external coat of polysaccharide that covers and supports its body.
How would that help with swimming?
I guess not. It is bilaterally symmetrical.
I mean, a jellyfish can swim and it's not bilaterally symmetrical.
Okay, good. It has a notochord that runs the length of its body.
I like that one.
Yeah, like that one. Let's try the other ones too. It has a well-developed body cavity that is completely lined in mesoderm. What is that referring to anyway?
Oh, that's the coelom. It's got a coelom.
Yeah, it does have a coelom, but would that help it in swimming?
No.
It undergoes complete complex metamorphosis.
I don't know what that has to do with anything. I underwent complete complex metamorphosis, and I can't swim.
Okay. So what's the right answer?
That's the notochord.
Yeah, it's the notochord. So the vertebrates are a monophyletic group that are defined by two synapomorphies. The first one is that they have vertebrae, which is a dorsal column of either bone or cartilage that goes around the spinal cord. And then the second structure is the cranium, which protects the brain, and the cranium could also be made out of bone or cartilage or fiber. And so the job of the vertebrae in the cranium is to protect the central nervous system and sensory structures. So the central nervous system consists of all of those nerves that run up the middle of the vertebrae and also the brain. So this kind of great innovation of having both this large complex brain and then this hard cranium to keep other animals from, kind of cracking you on the head and eating your brain is a key innovation in vertebrate evolution. All right, so general question. Guess which vertebrate has the most species?
Oh, I think it's the birds. When I'm up in the sky, there's so many birds. It's beautiful.
Okay. What else?
I think it's bugs.
Are bugs vertebrates?
No.
All right, try again.
Is it snakes?
I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's snakes.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think it's probably fish. 'Cause, fish are delicious. And there's a lot of them.
All right. You are right, Kat. It is the fish. So if we look at all the vertebrates, almost half of all known vertebrates are fish, and not just any fish, but ray-finned fish, which I'll get into in a minute. Sharks, rays, and skates form a little wedge like this, a little skinny wedge of lampreys. Mammals, so birds are pretty speciose, but not nearly as much as ray-finned fish. Okay, not so many turtles.
I didn't think there were that many turtles.
Did you know that there were this few crocodiles and alligators?
I think they're pretty noticeable when you find them.
Yeah, they are pretty noticeable. Okay. So let me go over some general themes of vertebrate evolution as we look at this phylogeny of the vertebrates. Oh, by the way, so this is just a reminder. So this little box in the corner is just orienting you. So remember we talked about the protostomes. We're like a sister group to the deuterostomes here. And then the chordates are one of the four deuterostome groups, right? Okay. So then this is the chordates over here. So remember the chordates, and then we have over here the other three groups of the other three groups of deuterostomes. All right, so the general themes that you find are, first of all, most vertebrates are extinct. Okay, so the ones that you see on Earth right now are just a small fraction of all the vertebrates that have ever existed. The second kind of a theme is that you have some traits that evolved more than one time, meaning that you have had convergent evolution where you have multiple lineages evolving similar traits. The third thing is that traits are sometimes lost, and so we should remember that evolution isn't a progression from being kind of a little simple creature to a big complex creature. Sometimes it is adaptive to lose traits and become simpler over time. Okay, So, urochordates are the closest living relative of the vertebrates. Remember we talked about urochordates and cephalochordates, right? So urochordates are the ones that are the closest living ones to the vertebrates. Which ones are the urochordates?
That's the tunicates.
Yeah. What was the cephalochordates?
Yeah, Lancelot?
Lancelet?
Yeah, Lancelot.
Okay. So the earliest vertebrate fossils were kind of fish-like. They were streamlined, they had gills, they had a notochord, they had a postanal tail. What other kind of tail is there? I don't know. And they had paired eyes. What, like they're going to have one eye? That's a great point. But they had two. Yeah, they had two, darn it. Okay, so they had some synapomorphies that allowed us to identify that they were vertebrates. So we could tell that they have these specialized neural crest cells and cells responsible for being able to form a brain, right? A cranium, which is the hard outer coating of the brain, and also cells that are involved in sensory perception. And we know that invertebrate chordate ancestors have the same genes for differentiation of brain cells, but they don't use them in the same way. So they have the genes that would allow them to make these different kinds of brain cells, but they just don't do the same thing with those cells. So we think that the genes predated having, kind of the brain, the cranium, and the sensory cells, but they weren't used to make those things until we got to the lineage of the vertebrates. All right, so the first two groups of vertebrates are the hagfish and the lampreys. And so they have a notochord, gills, and a muscular postanal tail. They have a three-part brain, paired eyes, and a cartilaginous cranium. Lampreys have cartilaginous reinforcements on their notochord, and hagfish don't. Consequently, a hagfish can tie itself into tight little knots, and lampreys are fairly stiff in their bodies. So hagfish and lampreys are sister species, and so this is kind of a new development. I mean, we always knew, yeah, hagfish don't have jaws and lampreys don't have jaws, but I don't think we realized that they were actually sister species until quite recently, and this was due to a molecular phylogeny that indicated that lineage broke off into those two groups. Okay. So here's the hagfish and the lampreys. So they're a sister group, right? So that's the first group we're talking about. They have a cranium, they have vertebrae, and they have paired sense organs. Okay? All right, so on this tree, there's a bunch of things that we call fish, right? So we tend to call, like, we'd say a shark is a fish, we'd say like a ray fin fish, like a goldfish is a fish. We would say a coelacanth, like this, was a fish, and a lungfish was a fish. So we call all these things fish, right? But they're not a monophyletic group. So their ancestor would be here, and a monophyletic group is an ancestor and all of its descendants. So fish are paraphyletic. Also, the jawed fish are paraphyletic, right? So hagfish and lampreys don't have jaws, right? So they're vertebrates, but we use the name Gnathostomata to refer to everything with a jaw, right? So this is jawed animals. So jaws appear here as well as paired appendages. But if we just look at the jawed fish, that group is paraphyletic as well. If you just look at the bony fish, so sharks, rays, and skates have a cartilaginous skeleton, and all of these guys have a skeleton made of calcium carbonate. And so if we just look at the bony fish, those are also paraphyletic. Okay. The lobe-finned fish, so these are fish that have big thick bones that they can use for support when they walk around, or not walk around necessarily, but kind of scrunch around on the ground. The coelacanths and the lungfish, this is also a paraphyletic group. So stuff with the lobe fins are called Sarcopterygiae. Okay, so these are the jawed fish, and I put this up here knowing that fish is a paraphyletic group. So the chondrichthyes include the sharks, rays, and skates. So they have a cartilaginous skeleton, and they have jaws. I think the jaws have calcium carbonate in them, though, because when you don't find the skeleton of a shark usually, but you do find their jaws. Actually, I once found part of a skeleton of a shark. It was super nasty. It was made out of cartilage, and it dissolved almost immediately. So normally all you find are their jaws and teeth. Ray fin fish, you can see here, they have this lovely kind of floaty little fins that have very thin support on them. So those are called ray finned fish. And that's like, there's 30,500 known species of ray fin fish. So if you think of a fish, it's probably a ray fin fish. Coelacanths, they look like this, and they have 4 fleshy lobed fins here. There's only 2 species of them. We used to think they were extinct, but then we found out they weren't. And then the lungfish, which I think we've talked about earlier in the class, and they also have these thick lobed fins, and there's only 6 species of those. Okay, so the jawed fish include those 4 major lineages: cartilaginous fish, ray fin fish, coelacanths, and lungfish. People have long asked where the jaw came from, so we have a pretty good idea about that. So, as I said before, cartilaginous fish like sharks and rays have jaws made of reinforced cartilage rather than bone. Well, I guess it's not, yeah, I don't know what it's made out of. Although you can find preserved teeth and jaws of those guys, so I don't know what it's reinforced with. We know that the ancestor of jawed fish didn't look like a shark. Okay, so even though sharks are more, they branched off before the rest of the fish, we don't think that sharks actually represent what their ancestor looked like. We see in the fossil record that jawed fish show up early in the Silurian, and they don't look like sharks. They're armored with bony shields on them. So sharks are just a lineage. The lineage that contains sharks and rays just kind of went off in its own direction. So the evolution of jaws is an important innovation in vertebrates because it improved the ability of the fish to be able to capture prey and also to bite. So like imagine swimming around in the water if you don't have like fingers and you don't have jaws. Like it's really hard to get food to go in your mouth. And so the evolution of the jaw allowed these lineages to no longer be suspension or deposit feeders, and instead they were able to actively hunt. All right, so our hypothesis for the origin of the jaw is that there was natural selection acting on these developmental regulatory genes that determine the gill arch morphology. So these are the gill arches. These are little bits of bone that support, you know how the gills are like holes between each of these bits of bone? If we didn't have these kind of bony arches in here, the gills might kind of collapse, right? And so these help the fish to be able to breathe well. Okay, so they have these gill arches. And so we think that if you had a minor tweak to some of the regulatory genes that control the gill arches in the front, that you could kind of morph them around like this and create what we see when we look at basal gnathostomes, where they have kind of weird jaws like this. And if we involve the first couple of sets of gill arches, then you get a bony structure that's much more similar to what we see in later gnathostomes. So we think combination of having mutations to these developmental regulatory genes and then natural selection, allowing the fish that had these mutations to be able to, catch more prey and have more babies, as what kind of led to the first working jaw. So there's similarities that we can see between the gill arches and the jaws that let us know that these are related structures. So like I said, gill arches are just bars of skeletal tissue that hinge and bend forward. And we know that they're derived from neural crest cells. Remember we talked about somites directing the formation of the neural crest cells? We know that the HOX and the DLX genes operate similarly in the gill arches as they do in the jaw. And we know that the same cells develop into the muscles that move jaw muscles and the muscles that move gill arches. So they have similar developmental pathway on a cellular level. But we don't yet have fossils, so I think this is one thing that we're still digging for. And so I think we have a very plausible way to imagine that the jaw could have formed that's backed up by developmental and genetic data, but we still don't actually have fossils of the transitional forms yet for this, so people are looking for that. All right, so there's 3 living lineages of bony fish. The ray fin fish, the coelacanths, and the lungfish. Where are we? Ray fin fish, coelacanths, lungfish. So all 3 of these groups have scales, right? So if you've ever touched a fish, they're kind of these slimy scales that are stiff but flexible. So those are protective. Many of these bony fish also have a gas-filled swim bladder So sharks, right? If they stop swimming, they will sink to the bottom. But the other fish, the ray-finned fish, the coelacanths and the lungfish, use their swim bladder so that they can maintain neutral buoyancy. It means if they stop swimming, they won't rise up in the water and they won't sink at the water. It'll just keep them level. Okay, let's talk about the origin of the limb. So we think that the transition to land happened about 365 million years ago in the late Devonian. And this was a major event in the evolution of vertebrates. And this is when you start to see tetrapods, meaning animals with 4 limbs. So we think that the transition to land occurred just one time in vertebrates, okay, around here when we start to see limbs appearing, and then gave rise to 3 major lineages of living tetrapods: the amphibians, the mammals, and the reptiles. All right, what are the 3 tetrapod groups?
Amphibians,
Yeah,
reptiles,
yeah,
mammals.
okay. In the evaluation of molecular phylogenies of the vertebrates, which of these statements are true? Cephalochordates are the closest living relative of the vertebrates.
Oh, that one's not true, because it's the urochordates, the tunicates.
Yeah. The ancestor of the jawed fish was probably hagfish-like.
In what way?
Well, let's see. The jawed fish, well, it had gill supports. I don't know about the statement. It's got some true things and some not true things. Let's keep going.
Okay.
Armored fish lineages are outgroups to the Gnathostomes.
Maybe.
Maybe. I mean, you think that the lineage that gave rise to the sharks looked like an armored fish lineage, yeah?
Yeah,
So it could be.
could be.
Reptiles and amphibians are sister groups.
That's not true.
Yeah, why isn't that true?
Because, like, reptiles and birds are sister groups, and, like, reptiles and mammals are sister groups, but amphibians are, like, the lineage that gave rise to the next one.
Yeah. How about reptiles are a monophyletic lineage?
Well, I mean, are birds reptiles? Because if birds are reptiles, then reptiles are monophyletic. But if birds are not reptiles, then they're not.
Yeah, I would agree with that. All right, so it looks like our best answer is this one here. So the outgroup to the Gnathostomes is probably something that looked like an armored fish, right? Rather than something that looked like a hagfish. So the thought is that probably at some point later on, the lampreys and the hagfish kind of went their own direction, but the ancestor of all of these guys was probably some kind of a bony armored fish. And when we do our lab on Time Walk, you'll get to see lots of pictures of those armored fish. Okay, so if we look at where lungfish live on the world right now, they tend to live in places without a lot of oxygen. So they live in shallow water that's kind of muddy and doesn't move around very much. And so modern lungfish can take in oxygen with their gills, but they can also gulp air from, just through their mouths and supplement it by lung breathing. So we think that we can learn a lot from how lungfish lived when we think about how fish initially came out of the water and onto the land. We can see homologies in fin bones and limb bones of tetrapods. So we know that the proteins produced by Hox genes are found at the same times during development and in the same places in those bunches of cells, in the fin cells and also in the limb cells. So we can see developmental homology between fins and limbs. And so once the tetrapod limb appeared, then you have this adaptive radiation happening where the limb becomes modified into lots of different shapes that would help for running or gliding or crawling or swimming or flying or whatever. So we have a fair amount of transitional species that show the transition from life in the water to life on land. So if we go back to Eusthenopteran at 385 million years ago, you can see that they look like a bony fish, not a bony fish. They look like a what's it? A fish with a big heavy bone in the arm rather than a ray fin fish. So they look like a lobe fin fish. Oh, as it says right here. Okay, so this big thick bone here. And then if we look at Pendrichthyes, we can see that the bone has become greater elaborated. And then by Tiktaalik, not only is the bone elaborated, but you can see that it's set, the fin is set in such a way that it can be used to kind of do little push-ups on, so that Tiktaalik can kind of crawl around on the edge of the water and pull itself out. By the time we get to Acanthostega, we're seeing a limb that's very much like a salamander. But like, look how many fingers he had, right? So if that had been our ancestor, we could have all ended up with a giant handful of fingers instead of just the 5. All right, by the time we get to Tulerpiton, we see that not only has the lobe fin kind of bone at the top become very much reinforced and kind of held out from the body so that you can walk around easily, also the other bones of the hand and the wrist have also become adapted to be able to support weight while walking on land. So amphibians were the first tetrapods to live on land. And so most amphibian adults will come out of the water to eat, but then they have to lay their eggs in the water because the eggs dry out very easily. They have a very thin shell. Most amphibians undergo metamorphosis from aquatic larvae to terrestrial or semi-terrestrial adults. They will exchange gases through their moist mucus-covered skin. So they can also breathe through lungs, most of them, although I used to work on salamanders, and the lineage of salamanders I worked on actually had lost their lungs to make room for being able to eat better, so they got all of their gas exchange through their skin. And there are 3 living amphibian lineages. So there are frogs and toads, there's salamanders, and then there's caecilians.
What is that? I've never seen one of those.
Yeah, we don't have them in the United States, but they are amphibians. They're kind of snake-like. They come in beautiful colors. They do some other fun tricks too. Apparently, a lot of them will give birth to live young, which is maybe what that mother Sicilian is doing with all those babies. All right, there we are. 3 groups: Anura, which is frogs and toads; Urodela, which is the salamanders and newts and stuff like that; and then the Gymnophiona, which are the caecilians. All right. As the vertebrate lineage diversified, several key innovations occurred. Which of these innovations is associated with the evolution of amphibians? Was it jaws?
No, there was already jaws before amphibians.
Okay, bony endoskeleton?
No, that happened after the shocks.
Yeah. Limbs capable of moving on land?
I think it's probably that one.
Okay, what else? Amniotic egg?
They don't have an amniotic egg. They just have a little egg.
Yeah. Endothermy.
What's that?
That's being able to generate your own internal heat.
Oh, they don't have that.
Okay, so which is it?
It's C.
All right, so we move now from the amphibians into the amniotes. So amniotes are all of the tetrapods except amphibians, and they're named amniotes because of the structure of their eggs. So they're named for the amniotic egg. And the amniotic egg is an egg that contains very specific layers, so it's more complex. It can live away from water. Okay, so if you remember, an amphibian or a fish egg has to be completely in the water to survive, but an amniotic egg does not. So there's 3 inner membranes that surround the embryo itself. So we have the allantois, which contains the waste, the yolk sac that contains the nutrients, and then all around the outside here is the amnion. All right. Yep. So the albumin is also there around the outside of that to provide water and mechanical support, and so it kind of gives the egg structure and also keeps the egg moist on the inside. And then the outside of like an egg, if you've ever noticed, it looks like it's watertight, but it's kind of not. It's actually quite porous. So for example, you can accidentally drown an egg. So if you're a duck and you lay your eggs too close to the water, and then the lake floods, your eggs will drown and die. So the eggs need to have a certain amount of air to be able to exchange gases so that the embryo can breathe. Around the very outside, you have a shell.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. I'm a tetrapod and I didn't come out of an egg. Oh, that's too bad. What? No, it's fine.
Okay, that's true. So, for example, mammals don't have something that looks like an egg, but what we basically have is like a structure that is like the egg has been retained in the body without the shell. Okay? So we'll talk more about that in a minute. Oh, here's a question. Which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Oh, well, look at that.
Well, where's the chicken?
It's a bird.
All right, so who has an egg?
They all has an egg.
Yeah, so which came first, the chicken or the egg?
I guess the egg.
All right. Let's talk about mammals. So mammals are monophyletic. They're named after mammary glands that produce milk. And the milk is used to nourish the young. So the process of sucking milk is called lactation. And if you look around at different kinds of tetrapods, you'll notice that only mammals are the only vertebrates that have cheek muscles and lips, right? Because we need that to be able to suck milk. So if you look at a lizard, he might have a beautiful smile, but he doesn't have any cheeks, right? The sides of his mouth are open. What about you, bird?
What about me?
Well, you don't have cheeks.
No, I don't have cheeks, but I put on rouge sometimes.
Well, that's fine.
Yeah, I think it makes me look happy.
Okay. All right. Mammals are endotherms, and it means that they have a source of heat. They can generate heat from their own metabolism, and so they can maintain high body temperature by taking food and using it, kind of burning up food and using it to make heat. And then in order to retain the heat, their body is covered in hair made of keratin, which helps keep the heat from being lost into the environment. There's three major lineages of mammals, the egg-laying monotremes, the pouch-bearing marsupials, and then the placentals, eutherians. There are three key lineages of mammals, the monotremes, which include the platypus and the echidna. So there's only 5 species of those. You know which ones those are because they lay eggs. The marsupials, which have a pouch, so that includes kangaroos, koalas, opossums, and wallabies. And then the eutherians, which are the placental mammals. And so marsupials, they have seed, but the babies are in a pouch for a short period of time before they come out. The eutherians have a well-developed placenta, and their pregnancy extends for a long period of time. Obviously, most mammals, you can see from this, are eutherians or placentals. So placenta is an organ that combines maternal and embryonic tissues. So the placenta is made partially from tissue from the mom and partially from tissue from the embryo. And it is used to be able to have gas exchange and also nutrient exchange. So oxygen and nutrients are flowing from the mother's developing embryo, and then all of the nitrogenous waste and carbon dioxide are being removed through the placenta. So the developmental period is gestation. So after gestation, the embryo is born. And people have often asked what evolutionary advantages there are of vivipary and placenta. So vivipary, do you remember what that is?
Yeah, it means having live young instead of eggs.
Yeah. So one advantage is that the offspring are always at a good temperature. You don't have to go find a good temperature for them to be at or a good place for them to be. They're protected, but also they're portable. So the mother isn't tied to a nest. She can go anywhere she needs to go to run away from predators or to be able to go find food. But all adaptive traits have some kind of trade-offs. So even though you have all these advantages of having a placenta and vivipary, the placenta is really energetically expensive to produce, and it's also very expensive to bear live young. All right, name the 3 lineages of mammals.
Monotremes.
Yeah, what else?
And placental mammals.
Yeah, what else?
Marsupials.
Okay. All right, reptiles are a monophyletic group. There's 4 major lineages: lizards and snakes, turtles, crocodiles and alligators, and birds. They have adaptations for life on land that are different from other lineages. So their skin is watertight. They have scales made of keratin. So remember, we have keratin on the outside of our skin, but it's made into hair that holds our heat in. But instead, reptiles are kind of waterproofed. They have well-developed lungs they use to breathe air. They lay shelled amniotic eggs. So like lots of times people get mixed up between reptiles and amphibians, but just take a look at them. What's on the outside of them? Is it soft and porous for being able to exchange gases, or is it watertight and made of keratin, you know? Do they lay soft squishy eggs, or do they lay amniotic eggs? Lots of many reptiles are ectotherms, meaning that they don't internally generate heat to regulate their body temperature, but instead move their body around to try to keep their body at the right temperature. Although some of them have the ability to, use some mechanisms to be able to generate a little bit of internal heat. So I think I put that as a fun fact on one of the labs a little while ago, where things like pythons can actually generate heat that they use to digest their food. Alright, so there are 4 key lineages of reptiles. So we have the lizards and snakes, we have the turtles, we have the crocodiles and alligators, and then we have the birds.
Yay, birds!
Yeah. Alright, so we know that birds descended from dinosaurs that had feathers, and so feathers were initially outgrowths of the skin composed of keratin. And so they can do things like provide insulation, they can be used to have a display to attract mates, and they can also provide lift and steering for flight. The endothermy that you see in birds evolved independently in birds and mammals, so endothermy evolved twice. People debate a lot about how feathers evolved, and so there is fossil evidence that the feathers evolved in smaller steps. So older feathers were very simple, but modern feathers are complex and branched. We have seen fossil evidence of feathers in multiple non-flying dinosaur lineages, and so the thought is that feathers preceded any kind of flying and were used for like insulation or mating displays, or to do things like help birds run up steep slopes to high perches, so kind of run, flap, flap, flap. But we have a lot of hypotheses and not really a clear way to test a lot of them. So some hypotheses, like I just said, running species could jump and glide, and the feathers could provide lift, or if you live in a tree already, you can use the feathers to glide from tree to tree or from tree to the ground. So once the feathers evolved in dinosaurs, there are a lot more adaptations that evolved to make flight more efficient. So birds are very light for their size. They have fewer bones. They have, remember pedomorphosis, where you have animals, or I guess it could be a plant, but animals that have features that are similar to the baby form in their ancestors. So birds kind of have a baby skull. You look at the ancestor of the birds, like a baby reptile skull that's bulbous, with a big brain and big eyes. And so that makes their skulls a little bit lighter. They have hollow bones instead of solid bones. They also have if you ever cut up a Thanksgiving turkey, they have like a keel or a breastbone that you use to get the breast meat off of the turkey, right? The reason why the turkeys have all that breast meat, or the reason why that bone exists, is that bone serves as the site of attachment for the muscles that are attached to the wings to make the wings move. Endothermy also allows birds to be able to have this high level of activity year-round. So lots of vertebrates care for offspring from many different groups. So you have, fish or other, kind of organisms that will fan eggs in the water to get more oxygen to the eggs. You have lots of different taxa in which there's egg guarding for predators. Amphibians will do things like keep eggs moist. Reptiles and mammals will often keep eggs warm and dry. In birds or lots of other groups, the parents will go supply the young with food, and then in some groups, the young stick around long enough that the parents are able to teach survival skills. So mammals and birds are the groups that have the most extensive parental care, and it can be energetically expensive to spend all of this time taking care of offspring. But if you do that, you can improve the fitness of the offspring by increasing the likelihood that they will survive and reproduce. And by having the offspring survive and reproduce, you've actually increased your fitness, right? More of your genes will make it into the next generation. So we think that the evolution of this extensive parental care might be one of the reasons why mammals and birds have done so well and been able to produce so many different species. All right, so we're going to ignore all of the other mammals and just focus in on the groups of mammals that we are, right? So we're going to just talk about primates. So this is kind of a tree up in the top here showing all different kinds of eutherians, and we're only going to focus on the primate branch. So the first group of primates are the prosimians, and so that would include things like lemurs, tarsiers, patos, lorises, you know, all of these little guys that are small-bodied, they live in trees, and they're nocturnal. And then everything else in the primates goes into the anthropoids. So that includes the monkeys, New World monkeys, Old World monkeys, gibbons, and the great apes. So the great apes include orangutans, gorillas, humans, bonobos, and chimps. So some defining characteristics of primates include that we have hands and feet that are very efficient at grasping. So instead of having claws, we have fingernails. And the reason why we have fingernails is because that allows us to have fingernails instead of claws allows us to hang onto a branch, and it allows the surface of our fingers to spread out so we can get a better grip. We have relatively large brains, color vision, complex social behavior, extensive parental care, and our eyes are in the front of our heads. Okay. So the great apes, or the hominids, have relatively big bodies with long arms compared to how short our legs are, and we don't have any tail, okay? So if something has a tail, it's not an ape, it's a monkey. So Curious George was not a very curious monkey, he was a very curious ape. Apes have very distinctive ways of walking. That are different from one another. An orangutan can live in the trees, but when it comes onto the ground, it will walk on its fists. Gorillas live primarily on the ground, and bonobos and chimps are mostly on the ground, and they will walk on their knuckles. And humans are the only living great ape that is fully bipedal, meaning that it walks upright on two legs most of the time. All right, so within the hominids is a lineage called the hominins. So the hominins are a monophyletic group that consists of Homo sapiens plus all of the ancestors of Homo sapiens that are now extinct. So there are 20 known extinct bipedal relatives that are considered hominins. So we would say that bipedalism is a synapomorphy that defines the hominins. Okay, so these are the fossil hominins that we have found, and a hominin is basically humans that are more closely related. Let's see. Well, okay. The hominins are the species of everything that's more closely related to modern humans than they are to chimps. But in terms of things that are alive right now, humans are more closely related to chimps than anything else that's alive, is basically what this is saying. And we know this based on DNA sequence data. So of everything alive, humans and chimps are most closely related. And so looking at the fossil record, the common ancestor of chimps and humans lived in Africa 6 to 7 million years ago. So the hominins, meaning the lineage that is more closely related to humans than chimps, is organized into 4 groups: the gracile Australopithecines, the robust Australopithecines, early Homo, and recent Homo. And the oldest fossil we found is Ardipithecus ramidus here. And then you can see here we have a variety of gracile Australopithecines, and then robust Australopithecines, early Homo, and recent Homo. And you can see that they overlapped in time. So, conceivably, you could have been some kind of a hominin walking around, and you could run into a completely different species of hominin. But we don't have that. We don't have that happening now. All right, so a little bit about each hominin. The gracile hominins are bipedal. Okay, they're called gracile because they have very thin bodies. This group includes like Lucy, which is one of the most complete Australopithecine fossils that we have. It used to be held at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. The robust Australopithecines include Paranthropus species, and they have really big jaws and teeth and a sagittal crest, meaning this kind of crest on the top of the head like a gorilla, probably because they were eating lots of grasses. And they were a monophyletic group, but they are now extinct. Early Homo And we say that these guys aren't extinct because they may have been the ancestors of some later lineages. Early Homo, so anything that's Homo we call humans, and they kind of look recognizable to us now, but they had flatter, narrower faces and smaller jaws and teeth, and bigger brains. They were tool makers. And then the recent Homo have flatter faces, smaller teeth, and larger brains. And this includes Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals. It also includes a tiny little fossil species called Homo floresiensis that was found in 2003 on the island of Flores in Indonesia. So it was a tiny little island full of tiny little people. Okay, so the homin, we're missing a syllable. The hominin fossil record indicates that all hominins are bipedal and that the tree has many branches to it. So it's not a linear progression from one species, kind of creating another species and disappearing and then another species. We tend to think because there's only one human species on Earth right now that that's the way it always was, but instead there were many branches and we just happen to be at a period of time when there's only one branch left alive. Compared with other hominins, Homo have extremely large brains relative to our body sizes. And we think that there may have been natural selection for the ability to reason and communicate, which was facilitated by the large brain. And so, yes, this may have been triggered by increased tool and language use that made it more advantageous to have a bigger brain. And so there was selection for humans to have larger brains. All right, so there are a couple of hypotheses for how humans spread around the world from their point of origin. The out of Africa hypothesis hypothesizes that Homo sapiens evolved in Africa and then spread throughout the world. And so there's fossil evidence of this. We find Homo sapiens first appearing in Africa and then evidence of fossils spreading out around the world. If you do a phylogenetic tree based on modern human genetic data, you find a really cool pattern, which is that the descendants of the oldest branches of the lineage are modern Africans, and they are the most genetically diverse. They have the highest genetic diversity. And then as people moved around the world, they had less genetic diversity, and then even less genetic diversity. So the lowest genetic diversity farthest away from the point of origin. And so what this is basically saying is humans moved rapidly from one place to another place, and there wasn't enough time between one bottleneck event and the next bottleneck event to be able to regain additional mutations and additional genetic diversity. So there is molecular evidence to support the out of Africa hypothesis, which is why we think this is what happened. So we think that the origin of human life happened over here in Africa. And so that was about 200,000 years ago in East Africa. And then humans spread to West Africa and then South, and then kind of went this way and kind of started moving around the Earth. And so we can find this kind of trail of fossil evidence going all the way around here. And we also find that people who live in West Africa now have more genetic diversity than people who are from here, than from people who are from North America or South America. All right, there is evidence that Homo sapiens interbred with other species as they migrated out of Africa. So if you look at Europeans and Asians, 1 to 4% of their genome is derived from Neanderthals. If you look at modern Africans, 0% of their genome is derived from Neanderthals. So the thought is that after Homo sapiens left Africa and then they arrived in the Middle East, they interbred with Neanderthals, and then they migrated throughout Europe and Asia. We think that there was a second interbreeding event where modern humans interbred with a species called the Denisovans in Central Asia during the first migration out of Africa. And so about 5% of the genome of Aboriginal Australians is derived from Denisovans. So even though you might not see Denisovans or Neanderthals kind of as their own species now, they are still walking around with us. And so the overall data support this out of Africa hypothesis, meaning that humans originated in Africa, and then this is with leakage, meaning other genetic lineages kind of leaked into the lineage of humans as they spread around the world. Okay, so which of the following lines of evidence supports the out-of-Africa hypothesis for the evolution of Homo sapiens? So 1, extant lineages.
What does extant mean?
It means currently living.
Oh,
Extant lineages in Africa have the lowest genetic diversity. Extant lineages in Europe have the highest genetic diversity. Extant lineages in Africa have the highest genetic diversity. Or extant lineages in the Americas have the highest genetic diversity. What do you think?
okay, wait. Okay, so like the highest genetic diversity was like in Africa, and then as people migrated other places, they lost genetic diversity through bottleneck events.
Yeah,
So which answer is that?
I don't know. Look at it.
I can't read, I'm a dog.
Okay. Well, how about this one? Does extant lineage in Africa have the lowest genetic diversity?
No,
Extant lineages in Europe have the highest genetic diversity?
no,
Extant lineages in Africa have the highest genetic diversity?
yes.
Yes, that's the right answer. All right, so hopefully we've covered a lot of ground in this chapter. We started with deuterostomes, talked about chordates and echinoderms, then we talked about vertebrates, then we talked about vertebrate evolution, then we moved on to the primates, and then talked about where humans came from.